Sunday, after he had given his talk, and after the children had shouted the academy motto, Professor Gelmet said the words again. "One more thing, leaders." The children froze. "Con Grossman and Titania Morgan, please come to the front." Con and Titania looked at each other in trepidation. "Please," said the professor curtly. "Now." They got up and approached the professor. "Con Grossman and Titania Morgan," said Professor Gelmet, "you are expelled from the Gelmet Academy." There was utter silence in the room. The other children stared in disbelief. "What for?" asked Titania Morgan eventually, in a voice that was so choked with shock that it barely managed to get out of her throat. "For behaviour unbecoming a leader," replied the professor. "You, Titania Morgan, were observed laughing when Bartholomew Jenkins tripped on his way to the swimming pool." "I was observed laughing?" repeated Titania incredulously. "Laughing?" "Do you deny it?" "No, it was funny, and I wasn't the only one who laughed. There was—" "Who?" asked the professor quickly. "Who else laughed, Titania?" Titania stopped herself. "No one, Professor Gelmet. No one. I suspect you're lying. See, even now you fail to behave in a manner becoming a leader." "What about me?" asked Con. "I didn't laugh. I wasn't even there." "You were observed climbing trees in the forest, beating your chest and yelling like a baboon." "Who observed me?" Benedict Goldberg and Bartholomew Jenkins exchanged a glance, sniggering. "It doesn't matter who observed you," said the professor. "It was a game," said Con. "We were playing. It wasn't only me, it was—" "Who? Who else was it, Con?" "No! Why should I tell you?" retorted Con, suddenly looking the professor in the eye. Perhaps he realised that nothing he said could save him now, so he may as well say what he liked. "I can yell like a baboon in the forest if that's what I want." "Correct," replied the professor. "You can, you did, and now I'm expelling you." "Where does it say in the rules you can expel me for yelling like a baboon? And where does it say you can expel her for laughing at Bartholomew when he fell over? It doesn't say you can do that." "It does." "Where?" "Here!" cried the professor, and he whipped an info tablet out of his pocket. He pressed it forcefully with his thumb and scrolled to the last page. "Read the small print, leaders!" he shouted angrily. "Read the small print! Behaviour unbecoming a leader will result in expulsion. Professor Gelmet shall decide what behaviour is unbecoming. There! Is that too much for you to understand?" He held the tablet up, although none of the children had any hope of reading the small print on the display in his hand. But they weren't trying to read it. They weren't even looking at it. They were too shocked at the anger on the professor's face. They had never seen him like this. They had never seen him even mildly upset. He was always so quiet, so calm, so steady, even when he had expelled Carlson Marx. Yet now he was glaring at them fiercely. His eyes, always so pale and cool, blazed with an angry fire. It seemed that he had utterly lost control. He screamed at them, "I'm giving you an education such as no one has ever had. No one! All I asked of you in return was to behave as I requested. I gave you a set of simple rules, yet it seems that these two children," he pointed viciously at Titania and Con, "are unable to do even this, unable or unwilling. So if anyone else is unwilling, you can follow them out the door, right now. Come on, speak up. Save me the trouble of dealing with you later." He paused, staring wildly at the children, breathing heavily, nostrils flaring. "Well, anyone?" he demanded. "Well, speak up. Now's the time." He looked at them for a moment longer. Then he shook his head in disgust and stormed out of the room. Dr. Fugg followed him. Hendrik Targ stepped forward, took Titania and Con each by an arm and ushered them away. The children watched. Titania and Con were gone. No one knew what to do. Bartholomew Jenkins stood up. "Come on," he said to Benedict Goldberg. "Let's go over blading." Benedict grinned and they walked out. No one else moved. "I've read all the rules," murmured Stanley, shaking his head in puzzlement. "But I can't remember seeing any small print." In the corridor, Dr. Fogg ran after Professor Gelmet. She could hardly keep up. The professor strode away rapidly, as if driven on by the force of his anger. "Professor Gelmet!" she called out to him. "Professor Gelmet!" The professor kept going. He went through one door with a quick glance into an iris lock, then another, a third, a fourth, and he was in his office. "Professor Gelmet!" said Dr. Fogg, following him. Dr. Fogg stopped. The professor had sat down in the tall chair behind his desk. The expression on his face changed. The anger disappeared. He smiled. Then he started to laugh. "Professor Gelmet?" The professor convulsed with laughter. Did you see? He began, but his laughter stopped him finishing whatever it was that he was trying to say. Dr. Fogg smiled uncomprehendingly. "Oh," said the professor at last, taking a deep breath, and he shook himself as if trying to drive the laughter away. "Did you see them, Dr. Fogg? Did you see the looks on their faces?" "Whose faces, Professor?" "The children's faces. Did you see the looks on their faces when I got angry? Like they'd seen a ghost." The professor laughed again. "Didn't know what hit them." Dr. Fogg wasn't sure whether she knew what had hit her either. "I don't understand, Professor." "I threw them off balance, Dr. Fogg. Why do you think I did it? What was that show of anger for? Why do you think I expelled those two children? Not for laughing at one of their classmates or yelling like a baboon, surely. Although the thing about the baboon does concern me a little. It's rather odd, don't you think?" "Why did you expel them?" "To create stress, confusion, fear, conflict. In short, Dr. Fogg, to see what will happen." Dr. Fogg frowned. "You look troubled, Dr. Fogg." "No, it's just..." The professor watched her. "What is it?" "Was that necessary?" asked Dr. Fogg eventually. "Well, it's a shame to lose two of the children, that's true, especially after losing that other boy. But we still have plenty left. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices, Dr. Fogg." "It's very harsh on them," she said. Professor Gelmet didn't reply. "Don't you think this might start to create problems, Professor? Perhaps it's taking things a bit fast. You don't think we should take things more slowly? I mean, like you said we would." Professor Gelmet stared down at his desk. "More slowly," he murmured to himself. "Like I said I would." He took a deep breath and shook his head. Then he looked up. "I expected more from you, Dr. Fogg," he said quietly. "I don't know what you mean, Professor Gelmet." "We don't have time for this. No time for doubts." Dr. Fogg looked at the professor uncomprehendingly. "Can't you see, Dr. Fogg? These children are changing before our eyes. Look at Bartholomew Jenkins. Look at Davina Macready. The helmet is changing them. If we don't act, we'll lose our chance to control the process." "But we control the helmet, don't we? If we control the helmet, we can..." "The helmet!" the professor interjected impatiently. "The helmet's only a part of the story. It gives them knowledge, yes, but when it comes to their personality, it's only part of what matters. The other part is what happens around them. The helmet and the environment, the two things work together. Don't you understand that by now? There's no point controlling one if you don't control the other." The professor shook his head impatiently. "How can we find out what effect the environment's going to have if we don't start to manipulate it? How can we learn more? We can't just hope that things like the Carlson Marx episode happen at the right time. We have to be sure they'll happen. We have to create events. Confront the children with things that surprise them, stress them, confuse them, make them question what's real and what isn't." "Manipulate the environment, Professor Gelmet?" Dr. Fogg whispered incredulously. "Create events? Make them question what's real and what isn't?" Yes, now you see, exactly." "But you said we were going to take things gradually, Professor. First things first, remember. You said we were years away from doing anything like that."
"When did I say that?"
"You said it to the people who came to see the project. I heard you say it." The professor laughed. "Them? Do you think it matters what I say to them? They just provide the money for the project. They're just donors." "But they didn't provide it for this. They provided it for..."
"What, Dr. Fogg?"
demanded the professor. What did they provide it for? Don't have any illusions, Dr. Fogg. They're not scientists. They're not interested in knowledge. All they're interested in is what they can get out of it for themselves. They think they're going to get a group of super smart people to work in their businesses. And why? So they can make more money than the businesses they compete with. That's all they care about. That's the only reason they give us a cent. Dr. Fogg shook her head, looking at the professor in confusion. But you said we weren't trying to change their personalities. You said it would be illegal. Did I? Yes! Perhaps I was exaggerating. I don't think so, Professor Gelmet. Then perhaps I wasn't. The professor sprang out of his chair. He came out from behind his desk. The great leaps in knowledge aren't made by people who ask themselves if everything's legal. He laughed contemptuously. We wouldn't have a single robot if that was true. You should go back and learn your history, Dr. Fogg. Robot technology was banned, wasn't it? But did that stop people developing it? Herman Segal, Ravender Beg? Oh yes, heroes now, aren't they? Household names, Segal and Beg. But at the time, if people had known what they were really doing, they would have thrown them in jail. Professor Gelmet paused. When we reveal to the world what we've done, Dr. Fogg, it will be the same. Just wait. We'll perfect the helmet. We'll learn thoroughly how to use it. If our donors weren't with us in this room, if they could hear us, they'd try to stop us now. Of course they would. They'd withdraw their money. So what? When the world sees the result, no one will care whether it was legal. All they'll care about is this amazing leap forward we've made, not how we've made it. Gelmet, and Fogg will be household names. Dr. Fogg stared at the professor in disbelief. Dr. Fogg, listen, Dr. Fogg, said the professor soothingly, and he took a step closer to her. Dr. Fogg took a step back. The professor's glance became cold. We're the experts, Dr. Fogg. It's up to us to decide what the experiment will be. Dr. Fogg glanced away. Dr. Fogg, you always knew this was an experiment. You knew it from the very first day. Do you deny it? Look at me. You knew, didn't you? Dr. Fogg bit her lip. Answer me, Dr. Fogg. Dr. Fogg looked back at the professor. She gave a very small, very quick nod of her head. You know, you've always known that we're doing things no one has done before. Let's be honest, we're filling these children's brains with knowledge to the brim. You and I have no idea what the effect of this is going to be. We talked about that. Let's not pretend we didn't. We recognized it from the start, didn't we, Dr. Fogg? Yes, she whispered, we recognized it, but you said we'd stop if the effect was negative. And we will. Have I ever said we wouldn't? Dr. Fogg watched the professor uncertainly. She tried to tell from the look in his pale blue eyes whether she could believe him. We haven't got to that point. We're nowhere near it, Dr. Fogg. We've barely begun. If we stop now, there's no value in anything we've done. The whole point of this experiment is to test the helmet, to learn how to use it, to see its results, to push it as far and as fast as we can. We always knew we weren't going to get leaders out of this batch of children. 1 or 2, perhaps, if we were lucky. How could it be otherwise? It's our very first attempt. It might take 10, 20 more attempts until we learn enough to succeed. The point with this batch was for us to learn, wasn't it, Dr. Fogg? That has always been the point, the real point, hasn't it? Reluctantly, Dr. Fogg nodded. But now, when I see them, Professor Gelmet, when I get to know them... Pull yourself together! You must stop thinking like that! The professor gazed at Dr. Fogg sternly. Now listen, people might say we shouldn't be doing this. They're the same kind of people who would have said that robots should never be created, who would have thrown Segal and Beg into jail. But do they use robots today? Of course they do. This experiment, Dr. Fogg, our experiment, is more important than anything Segal and Beg ever did. Its implications are more important than anything a robot could ever do. Imagine generations of leaders, great leaders for the world. Think of that. That's what we're doing here. Nothing must be allowed to stop our work. If you don't believe this, you shouldn't be here. You should never have been here in the first place. Do you believe it, Dr. Fogg? Do you? I did. Don't tell me you did. Tell me you do. Dr. Fogg frowned. I know you do, said the professor at last. I know you still do. He nodded. All we're doing is what we said we'd do at the start, testing the helmet to see its effect on the children. Nothing's changed. We're seeing something that we didn't necessarily expect, that's all, an effect on their personalities. But you didn't tell me it would happen. I didn't plan it. Perhaps I sensed it would happen. Hoped, perhaps, but I didn't know. Well, it's happening, Dr. Fogg. Quickly. Perhaps even faster than we'd like. So what are we going to do? Are we going to ignore it? Are we going to pretend it isn't there? Are we going to call everything off? Or are we going to test it? Professor Gelmet stared into Dr. Fogg's eyes. Well, Dr. Fogg, what does an experimenter do? Ignore it? Stop? Or keep testing? Professor Gelmet waited for Dr. Fogg to reply. Keep testing, said Dr. Fogg hoarsely. The professor nodded. Keep testing, he said. So make up your mind, Dr. Fogg. Now's the time to decide. Are you an experimenter or are you not? If not, you can get out. The professor gazed at Dr. Fogg for a moment. Then he turned away and left her to decide. He went to the iris lock, opened the door to the next room, and went inside. The image screen glowed blue in the darkness, and the faces of each of the 30 children stared back at the professor along the length of the screen. 29 faces, in fact. There was a gap in the line where Carlson Marx's face had once been. Professor Gelmet picked up a control palette. He walked along the screen. He stopped in front of Con Grossman's face. He used the palette. Con Grossman's face disappeared. He continued to the end of the line where Titania Morgan's face gazed back at him. A moment later, Titania was gone. 27 remained. The professor began to come back along the screen. He stopped in front of Bartholomew Jenkins. Then he glanced thoughtfully at Davina Macready's face, which was next to Bartholomew's. He smiled briefly. A strange coincidence, he thought, that they should happen to be placed so close together on the screen. He took another few paces and stopped again, staring at another face. Will Buster. The professor heard Dr. Fogg come into the room behind him. He's the one who really interests me, said the professor without turning around. His was the first act of rebellion. Do you remember? Bartholomew Jenkins used someone else to rebel. He hid behind Carlson Marx, but he took the risk himself. The professor paused. I'd like to see what we can do with him. The professor looked at Dr. Fogg. He didn't say anything to her about the conversation they had had in the other room. He didn't ask her what she had decided. He simply held out the control palette towards her and watched to see what she would do. Dr. Fogg hesitated. Then she reached for the palette. The professor pressed it into her hand. Bring up his details, he said in his usual brisk, practical tone of voice. Dr. Fogg used the finger pads on the palette. An array of displays came up on the screen. Who's he friendly with? Said the professor. Dr. Fogg pressed the palette again. Who? Tell me. Stanley Prowse, she replied. Davina Macready, they're his closest friends. No, said the professor. I don't want to lose them. Who else? Morag Himmelfarb, Grover Hicklethwaite, Carlos Detto. He's quite friendly with them, said Dr. Fogg. Her voice was becoming brisk and businesslike as well now. She moved closer to the screen. He plays pointy wibblers with Morag, Professor. He spends 48% of his activity time at the Wibbler Dome. With Morag? Sometimes, not always. Dr. Fogg worked deftly at the control palette. On average, Morag spends 32% of her activity time at the Wibbler Dome. Let's see, out of that... Dr. Fogg paused for a moment, concentrating as she brought up more numbers on the screen. She overlaps with Will Buster 73% of the time. The professor nodded. Morag Himmelfarb, he said thoughtfully. He walked along the image screen and stopped in front of Morag's face. What do you think, Dr. Fogg? We could afford to lose Morag Himmelfarb, couldn't we?
Thanks for joining us. Tune in tomorrow for another chapter of Will Buster and the Gelmet Helmet.